Hi there, my name's Bryony. I'm a psychologist and the head of coaching here at Relish. And today we're talking about codependency in relationships, 10 tips for recognizing and breaking the cycle. So you've probably heard of codependency, and there's a lot of confusion around what this actually is. So before I learned about it, I kind of thought it was just around people who become overly dependent on their partners. But it's kind of a broader subject than that, and a lot of it is to do with having, I guess you'd call it emotional contagion. So being highly impacted by the emotions of those around you and feeling a personal responsibility to look after the happiness of others. And this can be formed from your family of origin. It can be an emotional habit. It can be something that you do without even realizing. And so this is kind of part of codependency. So obviously forming really close and dependent relationships is part of this, but a lot of it is about trying to control the emotions of others in a positive way. So in order to kind of keep them happy and to maintain the peace. And again, this sort of thing can be formed in your early childhood. It could be from coming from a family of a lot of uncertainty or conflict, and you've maybe fallen into that role of the peacemaker. So it's great to understand a bit more about the nuts and bolts of codependency and to identify whether this is something that perhaps is an issue for you. So here are some things to think about. One of the first signs of codependency is extreme people pleasing. So essentially what this means is that perhaps you feel a really strong responsibility and a sense of guilt if you upset somebody or you don't meet their expectations. So of course we all like to help people and, I guess be nice to the people in our lives, but extreme people pleasing could be that you neglect your own needs to the point of, you're losing out because you're looking after somebody else's needs, or you feel really, really guilty if you say no to somebody, or you feel really frightened or worried about what's going to happen if you do say no or if you do displease someone. And we know this is hard because as adults we do have to sometimes disappoint people and say no, particularly in situations like at work and also in our personal relationships. So if people have identified that you do tend to be a people pleaser in the past, or you've noticed it yourself, this could be a sign that codependency is an issue for you. The second sign might be a clear lack of boundaries. So again, this comes from not really being able to recognize your own boundaries and really being guided by other people's needs and desires. So if you find that it is hard to enforce boundaries, whether this is on your time, on your even physical boundaries with your partner, maybe it's hard to say no, to help a friend or to do a bit of extra work. This again is a sign that you're not necessarily so in tune with your own needs and you're being guided and directed by these external forces. And again, this is an emotional habit which is learned early on. Another sign of codependency is low self-esteem. So it kind of goes hand in hand with the people pleasing and the lack of boundaries. But it could be that you sort of have this low sense of self-worth and a belief that unless you do look after the people in your life and you're there for them, you're not lovable or you're not worthwhile. So low self-esteem again arises from growing up in families which are in conflict, or there's there's not a great deal of support. It can manifest in things like substance abuse, feelings of guilt, depression, anxiety. If you experience low self-esteem, you're probably aware of it because people have either told you or you've noticed that you struggle to feel good about yourself, or you struggle with these sort of negative self-talk. So low self-esteem is something that can definitely be addressed, whether it's through coaching, counselling, even just the support of close friends and secure relationships. But as we know, it can really impact your day-to-day life and also your confidence and your ability to do things. Another sign of codependency is reactivity. So I guess this comes from sort of wanting to be in control of a situation. And so, if you're finding yourself very reactive and kind of explosive at times, this is probably because you're sort of quite tightly wound and you can be easily triggered by certain situations. So if someone's disappointed in you or you feel let down by them, you might have these really strong emotional reactions. And this tells us that there's something that's going on very, very strongly for you. Other things to consider are high levels of anxiety. So again, this is around the need to kind of be in control of a situation, and substance abuse as well. So this could either be in the person who's codependent, so they might be self-medicating with drugs or alcohol, or online shopping or using the internet, or it could be that they're in a relationship with somebody who is a substance abuser. So it's really common in codependent relationships to have somebody who is codependent having a partner who has an addiction. And so it's kind of this symbiotic relationship where the codependent person is trying to support them, really looking after them, but accidentally enabling them and kind of protecting them from the consequences of their substance use. So this is kind of the textbook picture of the codependent person who's in a relationship, but it's not really equal because they're kind of really focused on their partner's needs, and their partner isn't really focusing on their needs at all, is really just kind of stuck in this space where they can only focus on themselves. So as you can see, codependency is a really tricky thing to deal with, but there are some really helpful tips, and I would definitely recommend either therapy or some sort of relationship coaching if you're experiencing some of these signs of codependency, because it can be really helpful to unpack where they came from and also kind of rebuild that sense of self and your ability to look after yourself. But here are just some basic tips to get started if you've recognized some of these issues within yourself. So the first one is around nurturing yourself and your needs. So when we think about codependency, the big part of it is the neglect of yourself and the focus on the other. So getting in touch with your own needs and your own self-worth can be really, really helpful in terms of moving back towards a healthy self-esteem and sense of self. This might be really hard to do, and you might not actually be able to identify what your needs are. So you can try journaling, you can try talking to a friend about it, you can talk to a coach or a counsellor, just to get a sense of what do we think my needs are? What tells me what my needs are? Is it my emotions? Is it the things that I get really angry about? If I had to be forced to identify what my needs are, what would they be? So it can take a while to kind of shift your thinking away from what are other people's needs to what are my needs. And you can feel guilty, you feel like you're being selfish, but it's really important to identify that because that's kind of the first step. Another tip is to establish boundaries. So again, this is really hard, particularly because codependency is an emotional habit. But again, just like any behavioral change, start small and self-monitor. So it could be that you start setting boundaries at work with really small things. So saying no to a piece of work, maybe saying no to a friend who wants to catch up that you don't really want to catch up with. It could be in your relationship and talking to your partner about certain things that you're not comfortable with or certain things that are important for you to do. So again, setting boundaries, it takes a while to get used to it, but it's incredibly valuable. And most people who learn how to set boundaries effectively and safely find that their self-esteem improves, and also people respect them more because they're aware of their boundaries and when they're being pushed. Another tip is learning to recognize abusive behavior. So if you've grown up in a family or an environment where love, it wasn't necessarily straightforward, and perhaps abusive or neglectful behavior was normalized, it might be hard for you to identify this and recognize this in a relationship. So this is when it's really helpful to have some professional support around educating yourself what's okay and what's not okay, what sort of things are perhaps a bit of a warning sign in a new partner, what's some behavior that you are willing to accept and what you're not willing to accept. So if it hasn't been modeled appropriately for you, you might need to get some external support, and you can do this by getting therapy, coaching, reading books, or even talking to your friends about it and just workshopping situations that you're not so sure about and you're wondering, how could I have dealt with this differently? What's okay? What's setting off my triggers? Another tip for managing the codependent behavior is therapy. So I guess therapy is probably the most common way to deal with codependent aspects, because it does involve kind of looking into the past, unpacking what's happened, understanding yourself, achieving integration and building new skills. There's some downsides to therapy, of course, in that it's expensive and it can take a while to find the right therapist, but it can be really helpful to get some insight into where this came from, how it's played out for you, and the patterns that you're experiencing in your day-to-day life. Our final tip for managing codependency, which is perhaps a little less intensive than therapy, is Relish. So Relish is a relationship self-care app that has a lot of exercises around managing things like self-esteem, communication, boundaries. And sometimes it's a really good place to start here, which is it's a low-cost investment. You can talk to a coach one-on-one about situations which you might be a bit concerned about. You can learn about effective boundary setting and effective communication, and also kind of how to manage issues with self-esteem and communicate to your partner about these concerns, because that can sometimes be really difficult as well, is just kind of talking through with your partner about why you're setting boundaries and why you're sort of making these decisions. So Relish is really useful and effective if you're dealing with these sort of issues from the past and perhaps you're not quite ready to invest in a lot of therapy to kind of unpack it. But really, there's a lot of things that you can do, but getting social support and professional support can be fantastic because, like I mentioned, if you've grown up in an environment where there wasn't a lot of boundaries and you've developed these emotional habits of codependency, you do kind of need somebody who's outside of yourself to just give you gentle feedback and a bit of education around the sort of things to look out for, and also to validate you and prop up your self-worth too, because it can be really tricky to make this transition from being codependent and being guided by others' needs towards looking out for yourself and being kind of listening to your own signals. So I hope this has been helpful. Definitely have a look at Relish. There's a 7-day free trial at the moment where you can speak to a coach and check out the lessons. And that's it from me. Thanks for watching and see you next time.